Okay. So the last two parshiot of Devarim, the last two topics in the book of the whole Torah, is presented first in a poem. That's the whole parsha of HaAzinu. And then in Brachot, Moshe's last will and testament, as it were, a predictive will and testament to the different tribes. And we're not going to be able to go over that part, but we are going to look at the beginning, the introduction, because it's kind of a fascinating introduction to to the brachot. But the main thing is this Parshat HaAzinu, and the introduction to it actually is presented before HaAzinu in the end of the previous Parsha, Vayelech, and it describes what the purpose of this poem, which starts HaAzinu, what the purpose of the poem is. So we're going to take a look at this introduction. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hinecha shochev im avotecha. So God says to Moshe, you are about to join your forefathers. In other words, you're about to die. V'kam ha'am hazeh, and this nation, v'zana acharei Elohei nechar haaretz, are going to rise up and go astray after the foreign gods of the land asher hu ba shama, that bikirbo, that they're going to enter into the land. In other words, they're going to cross the river with Yehoshua, and after you die, you're going to die on this side, but they're going to cross, and when they cross, they're going to now immediately go astray after the foreign gods, va'azavani, and they're going to forsake me, says God, v'heferet briti, and they're going to break the covenant, asher karati ito, that I made with them, the covenant at Sinai, in which the people agreed to follow the words of the Torah in exchange for being brought in the land and given the land that God promised the ancestors. So, can you imagine Moshe on a day or two before he dies, hearing this? That God said, you know, all this,
Can I just interrupt? One sec. Had they not just agreed again a couple of Sedras ago, after Moshe was given his farewell speech sort of thing? They agreed again to say that they would keep the Torah.
So wait, hold on. Wait till the next couple verses. Okay. So God is telling Moshe, as soon as they enter the land, they're going to go astray after the foreign gods and break the covenant. Okay, and then what's God's response? V'charaf hapibo bayamahu, and I'm going to become angry on that day. Va'azavtim, and I'm going to leave them. I'm going to forsake them. V'histarti panai mehem, and I'm going to hide my face from them. That's an idiom. God hiding his face. It's the opposite of Ya'er Hashem panav elecha that we say in the Birkat Kohanim. Histarti panai mehem means I'm going to turn away from them and therefore remove my presence. So they're not going to be protected. They're not going to be blessed. I'm going to turn away and let whatever happens, happens. V'haya le'echol u'matza'u ra'ot rabot v'tzarot. And you're going to be consumed by your enemies, and all bad things are going to happen to you. V'amar, and in response to this, you're going to say, Bayom hahu, halo al ki ein Elohai b'kirbi mitzauni haraot ha'ele. Isn't it because God is not in our midst that all of these bad things have happened? So this sounds like, remember what we learned last time in the Parsha of Tshuva, it sounds like they are going to recognize that they did something wrong, and they're going to want to return to God. In other words, it sounds like a statement of, okay, we recognize that God is not in our midst. And we would expect that this is a first step towards teshuvah. But look what happens in the next pasuk. Va'anochi, and I, says God, haster panai bayomahu. And I, on that day that they make this statement, I am going to continue to hide my face from them. Al kol hara asher asa, because of all the evil that they did, kifana el Elohim acherim, because they have turned to foreign gods, to other gods. So we would expect God to say, well, okay, that's good to hear, and now I'll do my part and help you do tshuva, like we read before. But that's not what he says. He's going to continue to hide his face after the people said this. So how do we make sense of God's response to what appears to be an acknowledgement of the people that all the bad things that are going to happen to them is because God is not in their midst, and they're going to want to God. So
yes, Steve, I want to ask a question though. Could we also look at it that they are, instead of acknowledging that, taking the responsibility themselves, they're actually almost blaming God.
Very good.
Saying, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what they're doing, and this is what Hirsch points out of why God responds the way he did. So let's look at it, and that's
also it struck me that it's a bit like a child being some sort of addict, a drug addict or whatever, and the parent keeps helping and keeps helping and keeps helping, and the end says, no, you've got to do it on your own.
Yeah, but then the kid blames the
parents.
Right. Yeah. And so that seems to be what's happening here. So let's take a look. This is how Hirsch explains it, exactly as you guys explain it. By their statement, says Rav Hirsch, the people in fact did not recognize the cause of their misery. They don't say, God is not in our midst because I have forsaken him and broken the covenant. They left that part out. In other words, they're saying, why is God not protecting us? Because we have forsaken him and broken the covenant. Rather, they say, this evil has come because God is not in our midst. In other words, it's God, they're blaming God. It's not them, but God should be there. The difference between the two expressions is crucial. In the latter one, the one they actually say, the nation attributes its calamities to the absence of God, who, in their eyes, should be protecting them. In other words, their miserable condition is God's fault. He hasn't provided them with the promised blessing and the security. What they should say, but they won't say, says God, is that their own behavior caused God to remove his protective presence, and that the national calamities are a direct consequence of their own immoral defection. Such a statement which have indeed indicated a step towards teshuvah. Had they said that, that would have been a step towards teshuvah, but they didn't. Therefore, because they blame God and not themselves, God continues to hide his face from them. Okay. Now, why is this an introduction to HaAzinu? Because the way of the Torah in a number of places is whenever God threatens and explains what's going to happen and threatens with consequences of punishments, he always presents something they can do to avoid it. In other words, he presents the cure after he presents the pain. And so that's what this poem is going to do. So he says, V'ata kitvu lachem et hashira hazot. This is going to help them. It's going to help them avoid making the mistake that we just read. So God says, write this poem V'lamda et b'nei Israel, and teach it to the b'nei Israel, sima b'fihem. Sima b'fihem is also an idiom, means make them memorize it. Make it so that they can repeat it, they can say it. Leman tihiyeh li hashira hazot le'ed b'nei Israel. That this poem is going to serve as a witness, but look at there's a bet in front of b'nei Israel. It's not Leman tihiyeh li hashira hazot le'ed libnei Israel, a witness to them, but b'nei Israel means against them. That this poem is going to be a witness against the b'nei Israel. Ki aviena el ha'adama asher nishbati la'avotam zabat chalav udvash, because I am going to bring them into the land that I promised their ancestors, a land that's blessed, zavat chalav udvash, v'achal v'sava v'dashen. Now, if you remember Parshat Echev, what should happen is God is going to bring him into this land that has all these blessings. It has the Shiva Minim, it has water, it has everything. It's a whole description of all of the blessings of Eretz Israel. And there it says, V'yachalta v'savata uveirachta es Hashem Elokecha al ha'aretz hatova asher natan lach. That's what we say in Benchen for the second bracha. That you'll eat, you'll be satisfied, and you'll bless God for the good land that he's brought you in. But here he says that's not going to happen. V'achal v'sava, you're going to eat, you're going to be satisfied, v'dashen, and you're going to become fat, indolent. You're just going to sit there and enjoy the blessing, but be completely ungrateful. Ufana el Elohim acherim, and you're going to turn to other gods, v'avadum, and you're going to serve them, worship them, v'niyatsuni, and you're going to make me very upset at you, v'hefer et briti, and you're going to break the covenant. V'haya, ki timtzaena o Torah od rabot v'tzarot, and when all of these bad things are going to come, V'anta hashira hazot lefanav le'ed. Then remember, recite this poem of HaAzinu. And this poem of HaAzinu is going to give you the right perspective, is going to explain to you why, in fact, all these bad things have come. It's not because I deserted you and I should protect you. You'll see in this poem what really happens. Ki lo tishakach mipi zaro, because this poem should not be forgotten from the mouth of your descendants. Ki yadati ki yitzro, because I know your natural inclination. Asher hu osa hayom b'terem avienu el haaretz asher nishbati, because I know what's going to happen. I know that your natural inclination is going to be to serve other idols and to forget God, who's giving you all of this. So therefore, God is giving him a prescription for how you could avoid being this punishment by reading and understanding this poem. Vayichtov Moshe et hashira hazot bayamahu vayilamda et bnei Israel. So Moshe wrote this poem and taught it to the bnei Israel.
So Steve was saying almost these bad things are going to happen, but this poem is a form of tshuva, in a sense.
It's a form of a witness against you, so that if you read the poem, you can avoid the mistake. In other words, your natural inclination is going to break the covenant and serve God and serve idols, and that's going to bring a disaster, a catastrophe on you. So if you say this poem, if you're going to remember this poem, it's going to serve as a witness of why this is going to happen, and hopefully you will avoid it by not doing it. So this is meant to be a positive thing, something that if the people memorize it and their children memorize it, when things start to become bad, they should pronounce this poem. They should remember this poem that they memorized, and the poem will tell you what the problem is and what the solution is. And that's what this haAzinu does. So the haAzinu is really divided into three parts. The first part is to describe in poetic imagery how the people have been ungrateful. They're ungrateful to God who provided them with everything that they needed for the 40 years in the desert, who brought them safely into the other side of the Jordan and is going to bring them into the land. They are ungrateful, and they use the poem uses the image of a child, an ungrateful child to a parent. A parent raises a child when they're little and they can't fend for themselves, so the parent takes care of them. The parent feeds them, the parent protects them, the parent lets them grow, the parent gives them clothing, the parent does what parents do to their children. And the poem says, well, you're going to grow up and you are going to be like ungrateful children. You're going to rebel against your parent who gave you all of this stuff. So that's the first part, to tell them why bad things are going to happen, because you're ungrateful. You're ungrateful people. The second part is all the bad things that are going to happen, all the things that you can expect because you're going to break the covenant and you're going to serve foreign idols. Bad things are going to happen, and it delineates all the bad things that are going to happen. But the interesting part is the third part, and that has some very interesting relevance to contemporary times. Let's look at the third part. Wait, before we get to the third part, look at the prologue, the first line of haAzinu. It says, haAzinu hashamayim va'adabera, v'tishma ha'aretz imri free. Now, in most poems, you have parallelism. In other words, the first half is then repeated with different words, with synonyms in the second half. And so these two psukim are going to be parallelism. So haAzinu hashamayim va'adabera. Haazin means to listen. The heavens are going to listen, and I'm going to speak. Tishma ha'aretz imrei fi, and the earth is going to listen. Tishma and haAzin are parallel. Will listen to what I'm saying. Ya'arov kamatar lichi. My teachings are going to come down like rain. Tizal katal imrati, the things that I say will come like dew. It's a very soft moisture. Kisi'irim ale desha, as a light rain on grass. V'chirivivim ale esev, and a stronger rain on the vegetation. So this is like an image. But what's interesting is that God is calling, in this poem, God is calling the heaven and the earth to be witnesses to what he is going to say. Now, why the heaven and the earth? So, and this is not a new idea. God said earlier in chapter 30, heaven and earth I have appointed this day to be witnesses. And also in the next chapter we read, and I will appoint the heaven and the earth as witnesses against them. In other words, three places God says the heaven and the earth are witnesses. So why use that expression, poetic expression? And Hirsch says it's intentional because witnesses in Jewish law have two functions. First, they are to warn the potential offenders of their crime. So when somebody says you have two people who are fighting with each other, and one of them says, I am going to kill you. So the witnesses to that statement have to first warn that guy and say, don't do it. Don't kill him. And then if the warning is ignored and the crime is committed, those same witnesses, according to Jewish law, are the first to inflict the punishment, capital punishment to a murderer. Okay, in other words, the witnesses have two functions. First, they're supposed to warn, and the same people who warned and were ignored are the ones to inflict the punishment. So God uses the Shemayim va'aretz as witnesses. He sends warning signs through nature, like we read in the Shema. If you listen to God's teachings, then you'll have blessings. But if you don't, v'im lo tishma'u el mitzvotai, then you're going to get poor crops and no rain and all the bad things that are going to happen in the second paragraph of the Shema. So the nature serves as warning signs to people. If they see that the land is not going to be fruitful, that should remind them that, like witnesses, that it's a warning. You're doing something wrong, so you better change. And if the nation still persists in its defection, then it's the heaven and the earth that's going to afflict the curses. And we read that in the descriptions of the bracha and the klala, the two ones in Vayikra and Devarim, that the natural events are going to cause all of the curses that are going to happen to the people. So that's why God calls on the Shemayim va'aretz as witnesses, first of all, because they are eternal. They're not like human witnesses. There are witnesses who will always be here. And just like the poem is going to always be there. So the Shemayim and the Aretz are going to be like eternal witnesses to warn people, and then they're going to be the ones to inflict the punishment. Then the natural forces are going to inflict the curses that are going to come upon the people. Okay, so now I said the first part is to show their ingratitude. The second part is to show the bad things that are going to happen. But look how it ends. Up until this point, God has poured out his wrath on the ungrateful and the unfaithful Israelites, but he has decided to spare his people because the other nations will take credit for Israel's misfortune. It's interesting. In other words, why wouldn't God just give up and say, the people have now changed their loyalty from me and the brit that they made to the foreign gods. And then so whatever happens to them, as he predicted. He's not going to do that. He says that because the people who are going to be the tools of punishment for Israel, in other words, those people who are going to fight and be victorious and oppress and conquer the Israelite nations, they are going to claim credit. They're going to say, you see, we did this. It's not God who is punishing his people, but we are strong nations, and we're just going to take out Israel because we can. So in these next verses, Moshe observes the Israel's enemies foolishly thinking they are superior to God, rather than recognizing that they are merely instruments of his retribution. Like in history, Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylonia, they were all God's instruments of the retribution on the people for forsaking God and going after the worship of idols. They have no insight with which to draw truthful conclusions about their political victories, and if they were smart, they would see that just as Israel's punishment is a judgment from God, so too will he judge them. And that's what the poem starts to say. Just as they did to his people, God is going to do to them. Significantly, Israel is still, even after all of this, and even after they're punished by foreign nations being victorious over them and taking everything away from them, Israel is still called his people, his servants. God does not give up that relationship. Despite the nation's complete estrangement from God, Why the change? When God sees that his people are powerless, being scattered among the nations, they're all in exile, his servants will have learned the lesson of this poem, and God will take up their cause against their oppressive hosts. Rabbi Hirsch explains that although God has withdrawn his protection, Hester Panim, resulting in Israel's helplessness and surrender to her enemies, this was not a justification for conquering nations to abuse or torment his people. That's interesting. In other words, what God says, I'm using you as instruments of my retribution. So number one, don't take credit for it because I'm allowing you to harm my people. But number two, you don't have any justification. Once you've conquered them, you have no justification to abuse and torment them. In the first three verses of this section, God warns Israel's oppressors that they are vulnerable to God's midah keneged midah, measure for measure, attribute of justice. As they do to Israel, so will be done to them. But God is the Father of all humanity, derives no pleasure from chastising any nation, and therefore, in the Pasuk, God appeals to all nations, among whom Israel will be scattered, to make the lot of his people a happy one, to not oppress them or treat them cruelly. That's fascinating. In other words, although God is going to allow the enemies to conquer Israel and to disperse all the people in exile, they have no permission to treat them cruelly. And although they conquer them, they have no permission to oppress them. There are three reasons for the host nations to deal well with Israel. And again, in the Psukim, it tells you why the nations should deal well with Israel despite the fact that they conquered them. First, although Israel may be exiled from its soil because of its sins, Israelites still remain his servants. They still retain an unbreakable relationship with God, and therefore you have no right to deal cruelly with God's servants. Second, the God of justice demands humaneness, and decency from all human beings. Even if you're a conquering nation, you have to be decent in the treatment of those who you've conquered. Therefore, those who deny basic human rights also deny God's moral imperatives and thus leave themselves open to God's retribution. In other words, if you deny human rights to other human beings, not only his people, and in our context, it's the Bnei Israel, but God is saying that if you abuse anybody, then God is that's going to leave you open to retribution. The Jewish nation is destined to bring atonement to civilization when it properly fulfills its destiny as the mission of Or LaGoyim. Remember with Abraham that the whole purpose of creating the Jewish nation is to be a model. V'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. And he said to Abraham in the very beginning, the first line, those who bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. In other words, it's your job to support the Jewish people so that it can fulfill its mission of being a model nation. And if you oppress Israel and inhibit its progress, then God is, and which frustrates God's plan for a moral and ethical world, then for all these reasons, God advises the nations to make their lot happy. In other words, those nations, we can see it now. Look, those nations who make it their business to delegitimize Israel, whether it's the 120 nations that vote every month that Israel is an apartheid state and is guilty of genocide. They do that automatically. So all those nations, God said, are not going to be blessed. And as in fact, they're not. You look at all the Arab nations that vote against Israel, they are poor, they are run by dictators who are corrupt, they have nothing, they don't produce nothing, they are nothing. They're just controlled by other politicians, and they're not, they're not blessed at all. And now all the other nations, the EU and the nations in the West and the East, who all delegitimize Israel instead of supporting her, are all, according to this poem, are all going to suffer, are all, because they're frustrating God's plan for Israel to be a moral and ethical model, so they are going to suffer consequences. Now it's not immediately, but if we look back, if we're all around in 20 years from now, what I think we're going to see is that all of these nations that are pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian and want to destroy Israel, they are not going to be successful nations. And while Israel is going to become stronger and stronger. That's all in this predictive poem, which is an amazing way to end the poem. So God says, even though I'm going to use you as my way of showing my punishment to Israel for not keeping the covenant, you have no right to treat them cruelly and to not make their lot in exile a happy one. Okay, which
yes, Steve, a continued lesson about what happens to people, whether it be the nation of Israel, a warning to them, or to these other nations we're talking about now, who refuse to take any responsibility.
Right. And we are very frustrated when we see all of this anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and support for Hamas. It's very, very frustrating. The end of this poem says, don't worry. They are vulnerable to God's measure for measure and attribute of justice. They're not going to ultimately get away with all of this. They're not going to be blessed because they're cursing Israel. And those who curse Israel will be cursed. And, we may not see it immediately, but we have to be comforted in the fact that there is justice in this world, and God is not going to forsake his nation. And he is going to see to it that those who don't treat us correctly are going to suffer consequences from him eventually. So it's a fascinating poem, and well worth read. It's hard to read because it's all poetic language, but if you see these three parts, the first being the ingratitude of Israel and its breaking the covenant, the consequence of exile by enemies, and the third part is that God is not going to give up on the people, and God is we are still his servants, we're still his children, and it's the nations who oppress us and curse us that are going to get God's justice eventually.
But we're not in exile anymore, surely.
What?
We are not in exile. We are here in the land.
Correct. We are here, but the dynamic is the same. We're here, but we're still being delegitimized and oppressed by the nations of the world. And what God is saying, the purpose of Israel is to become a model, and you should be supporting it, not delegitimizing it. And if you're going to do that, then know that God is going to take retribution against you as nations, as societies. In other words, you'll pay for this. You'll pay for this. And it is a bit of comforting when we see that eventually they're not going to get away with it, but it may not be in our time, depending on when God chooses. But even now, what kind of a nation is Yemen? it's a broken nation. There's nothing to it. What kind of a nation is Iraq? What kind of a nation is Syria? What kind of a nation is even Egypt? They are all broken societies who have no economic blessing at all, and they just get by with corrupt dictators. There's nothing about them that is a blessing. Okay? And that's what is predicted here. They're not going to be, those nations are not going to be blessed. And eventually, Iran is like in our crosshairs. Iran's not going to get away with it either. Hezbollah is not getting away with it. Hamas is not getting away with it. And, because they have treated us in inhumane ways. And God says, they're still my people, and they're still my children, and they're still my servants. And I am going to take retribution on those who treat them poorly. So that's what we have to look for. Okay, now in the Vzot haBracha, just to sort of give it a little bit of attention, most of it is the blessings for each tribe. If you remember, we went, who else gave blessings for each tribe?
Before the Vzot, Yitzchak and Yaakov.
It's Yaakov,
right?
Yaakov specifically on his deathbed, remember? On his deathbed in Vayechi, he gives blessings to each tribe. And Moshe is doing the same here. He's naming each tribe and giving a characteristic prediction of its future. And if you take Moshe's blessings and characterizations and you combine it with Yaakov's, you see that there is a sort of a consensus between the two. In other words, they're saying a very similar thing, which is fascinating. So the characterization of each tribe, now Moshe is doing it because his characterizations are related to their geographical location. So the tribe that's going to be on the shore is going to be blessed with being a merchant nation, because the one where ships come in, and that's where all the economic merchant vessels come. So that's their bracha. And so each one has a bracha depending on where its allotted section is, that they were given by Moshe by lottery, and so with Yaakov, his blessings were more in character. In other words, what's going to be the character of each nation, and this one is what's going to be the economic characterization of each nation. But the two are very, very similar if you compare the two. That's what we did when we did Yaakov's blessing. We integrated the blessings of Vzot haBracha, and they're basically a consistent image of the characterization of each tribe. But what I want to point out is the beginning. The verse 2 of Vzot haBracha is a poetic introduction to Moshe's blessing, and it is very difficult to comprehend. We don't know what it's trying to say. These are the words. Moshe says, God entered from Sinai, shone on them from Seir, dawned upon them from Mount Paran, and then came from the myriads of the holy ones, meaning angels. At his right hand was a Eshdat, a fiery law to them. Now, all the commentators are trying to figure out, well, what is he talking about? What's the allusions? What is Moshe trying to say as an introduction to all of this? So they're saying, first of all, the easiest one is, what is an Eshdat, a fiery law? Well, if you look at the beginning, God entered from Sinai, and you see the last line, he gave a fiery law to them. So it's pretty clear that what it's talking about is the Torah, because that's what happened at Sinai, and the law, Eish Dat, is called all the teachings and the laws of the Torah are called a fiery law. And there's an explanation of why I call it a fiery law. Well, picture God at Mount Sinai. How did the people see him give the law? They saw fire, right? A fire in a cloud on top of the mountain. So the law that was given at Har Sinai was called a fiery law. And so that part is fairly easy to understand. But what is the middle verses referring to? So the Sifrei, which is a midrash, sometimes midrashim are not based on the pshat of the psukim. Sometimes they're just sort of made up fictional stories to teach, like a drasha, a rabbi's drasha to say what they want to say, but using a verse as a jumping off point. But other midrashim are attempts at actually analyzing the words, but having to inject the implication of the words that are not evident, but they have to have basis for it. In other words, if you have a basis for the midrash, then it's not considered an agadah. It's not considered just a story. It's considered a explanation of the verse because you can back it up with sources. So the commentary of the Sifrei on this verse is backed up by sources, and it gives us a midrash that, again, the whole purpose of a midrash is to teach some eternal, universal truth that is relevant at all times. So according to this, the sages who made this drash, Seir and Paran represent national archetypes, not geographical locations. It appears from the verse that we're talking about, since we talked about Sinai, that's a geographic location. And so if you mention Seir and Paran, then it seems as if these two are also geographic locations. But Hirsch says, no, in explaining this midrash, Seir and Paran are not geographic locations, but they are archetypes of people. Okay, how does that work? Seir is the name of the land settled by Esav. Remember, because of the pasuk, it says Esav settled on Har Seir. So very clearly, the pasuk says Har Seir is Esav's land. And another pasuk says in Devarim, when it's reviewing everything, I gave Har Seir as an inheritance to Esav. So clearly, Seir is a reference to Esav. Paran, on the other hand, is associated with the descendants of Yishmael. As we infer from Bereshit, also there's a pasuk, God was with the boy Yishmael, and he grew, and he became an archer. And where did he settle? He settled in the wilderness of Paran. So Yishmael is associated with Paran. So what we have now is now not two mountains or two geographic areas, but an association with Esav and Yishmael. Okay, so now how does that work? What did they do with that? So the well-known Midrash describes how God first went to the descendants of Esav to offer the Torah. Remember, these first lines are referring to the Torah that God gave on Har Sinai. So according to this introductory poetic verse, God first went to the descendants of Esav to offer the Torah, but they rejected it because in it says you're not allowed to murder. And since Esav's father Yitzchak blessed him with the words, "By the sword you shall live," al haBracha tichya, meaning you're going to be a warrior who is going to go out and kill people. The tribes of Esav, said the Midrash, were not interested in accepting a legal system which you couldn't go out and kill people. So they rejected it. So first, God went to Seir, and they didn't accept the Torah. Then he approached Ammon and Moab, which is not referred to in here, but the Midrash says Ammon and Moab had the same offer, and they also rejected it on the grounds that the Torah prohibits illicit sexual relationships. And remember, both of them remember the story of Lot and his daughters. Both Ammon and Moab come from an incestuous relationship. So they said, well, we're not interested because of all of this stuff that we read in Mincha and Yom Kippur that doesn't allow incestuous relationships. God offered the Torah to the descendants of Yishmael, but of Moab and Ammon, and they rejected it. And so then God offered it to the descendants of Yishmael, which is Paran. And they too refused it because they couldn't accept the prohibition against theft. And what's the association? Because with Yishmael, we read, he will be a wild man. In other words, he's going to be a lawless person, and his hand will be into all things. He is going to, sort of beat up people and take from them, attack others, and take possessions. And so God went from one nation to the other, ends the Midrash, who all of them rejected the Torah because of what's written in it, until the Torah was offered and accepted by Israel at Sinai. So if we go back to the Pasuk, see if we can get back there. Here, Moshe said, God entered from Sinai. So that's describing God being on Har Sinai. He shone on them from Seir. Shone means illuminated. In other words, when God illuminates his presence, he's teaching something. God taught them Torah to Seir, to Yishmael, and they declined it. He dawned upon them from Mount Paran. Again, dawn meaning light. He also tried to teach it for the descendants Seir was Esav, and Paran is Ishmael. And then came from the myriads of the Holy Ones. So what is that? We haven't explained that. What's the myriads of the Holy Ones also didn't accept the Torah. So now we have to explain that last line. Let's get back here. Okay, so now we're able to return to the first verse. God's presence entered at Sinai where Israel accepted his Torah. Using the metaphor of dawn breaking, God's presence is illumination. And the verse said he had shone forth from Seir. He had dawned from Paran. That is to say, in figurative language of the poem, God's presence approached the people of Esav, approached the people of Yishmael, and with the offer of his light, but they rejected it. The full light of God's presence only appeared, therefore, on Sinai to the people who did accept it, and that Am Yisrael. But what about the myriads, the holy ones, the angels, who God apparently rejected as well? That God presented the Torah to the angels. They, said Rav Hirsch, are the myriads of angels who stand in perpetual service of God, and they too were ineligible to receive the Torah and to become God's model nation because they are spiritual beings with no free will or free choice. Angels are angels. They have.
So why was it offered to? Why did God offer it to them, knowing who and what they are?
Because they're teaching us this thing, that the Torah is given to human beings who can freely commit themselves to obey God's will as expressed through his Torah. The Torah is of no relevance to spiritual beings that are neither capable of sin nor capable to choose allegiance to God. So in other words, what it's teaching us is the Torah has to be given to human beings. The human beings who accepted it, the only human beings, the only society that accepted it are the Bnei Israel at Mount Sinai, and therefore the Torah was given as a morasha to Kehilat Yaakov, as the poem will say very shortly. It'll say, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha Kehilat Yaakov. It's given to the Jewish people and nobody else, and it can't be given to even the holy angels because the Torah has no relevance to them. They can't choose to observe it or not observe it, so it's irrelevant. Okay. So one thing we'll close on is after this whole poem, there is a line, Vayomer Alehem, Moshe says to them, Simu levavachem lechol hadavarim asher anochi me'id bachem hayom. Pay attention to everything that I'm teaching you today. Asher titzavum et b'neichem lishmor la'asot et kol divrei haTorah hazot. That I'm telling you and your children to keep, to observe all the divrei Torah, all of the teachings of God, all the laws and all of the teachings. And then there's an interesting line, Ki lo davar reik hu mekem. How do we translate that? What does that mean? Okay, Ki lo davar reik hu mekem. So the simple translation is because all of these teachings of the Torah is not something useless to you. Ki hu chayechem, it's your life. Ubadavar hazeh ta'arichu yamim al ha'adama. And by keeping the Torah and its teachings, you will continue to learn to live on the land. Tem ovrim et hayardem shama lerishta. In other words, by keeping the Torah and not going and worshiping idols, you will, you and your children will won't be in exile. You'll stay on the land that I'm bringing you to. So that was like the summary paragraph. But the Jerusalem Talmud has a twist on this phrase, Ki lo davar reik hu mikem. It says, if you see the Torah as empty, it is your fault. Ki lo davar reik, because it's not an empty thing, hu mikem. If you see it that way, it's because you see it that way. In other words, the Torah is not empty. It's not irrelevant. You see it as hu mikem. It's the way you see it. So that's one way that they translate that phrase. But Hirsch offers two other meaningful readings. One meaning is the charge for you to observe and keep the Torah is based on the fact that no part of the Torah is empty for you, that is irrelevant to your day-to-day practical life. Each individual is capable of finding personal meaning in all the Torah's teachings. And this is a fundamental point of all the teachings of Hirsch in his explanations of the Torah and of the law, that there's meaning in all of the Torah's teachings, and that's eternal. So no part of the Torah, even though it appears that it's not relevant anymore, like korbanot and slavery and all the things that seem not relevant, he says, no, there is nothing in the Torah that is irrelevant to your day-to-day practical life. You just have to pull out the value in the teaching from what it is that the Torah is teaching you and see that it's applicable at all times to your practical daily life.
So it's Torah chayim.
Right. Ki hu chayechem. It said the next three words in the pasuk. Ki hu chayechem, because it is your life. So that's one meaning. The second meaning, he says, the contents of the Torah are not empty of you. Mikem can be translated of you. The contents of the Torah are not empty of you. In other words, the living Torah is infused with your being. You exist in it. It is not empty of you. It is your very existence. In other words, when the Torah in a number of places It says, "V'shinantem levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha v'yahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavecha v'chol nafshecha v'chol meodecha," meaning the Torah is infused with your whole being. You exist in the Torah. It is not empty of you, it is your very existence. So these are two sort of philosophical, abstract statements, but they're the closing statements of Moshe to the people to keep in mind. A, that no part of the Torah is irrelevant, and B, that all the contents of the Torah are infused in you and exist in you and give you meaning to your life. Okay.
Very good. Very interesting, Steve.
That's our ending and summary of the whole Chumash.
You're again leaving us with much to think about.
No, absolutely. The Torah always leaves us that way, and this is the purpose of the last two parshas of HaAzinu and Vzot haBracha, to leave us with something that's eternal, that's relevant to us.